Okay, this is the second in two videos on federalism, and in this video I want to begin with enumerated, concurrent, and reserved powers in an effort to help us understand how the national government has grown more powerful since the founding. Here's another list. Again, you don't have to write all of these down. I'm not going to test you over these. I'm using this so you have an idea of the system of power between the federal and state governments that was set up by the Constitution. So on the federal government side, you can see enumerated powers. These are powers that are laid out specifically in Article 1, Section 8 that we looked at earlier in the semester. They are powers directly given to the federal government. And as we talked about, it was done to make sure that the federal government had sufficient power to solve problems that the government under the Articles of Confederation could not. Now, there are some powers denied to the federal government in the Constitution, and those are listed at the bottom of that column. On the far right column are powers given to state governments, reserved powers. Um, Reserved powers, you can see it's to regulate commerce within a state. Federal government has the power to regulate commerce between states. Um, the state governments have the power to provide for public health, safety, welfare, and morals, to establish local governments. These are all powers reserved to state governments, but there are also things they can't do, and these are laid out in the Constitution. They can't coin money, they can't enter into treaties, etc. But there are also powers that are exercised by both federal and state governments. So collecting taxes. There's state income tax, there's federal income tax. Um, there's that both state governments and federal government can borrow money. They both make and enforce laws. There's both state court system and a federal court system. They can both charter banks and corporations. There's a variety of things that both state and federal government can do. Those are called concurrent powers. So I wanted to talk about those because I wanted to highlight these three aspects of the Constitution. So Article 6, Section 2, you could take some time and read through these and try to determine what each of these articles is talking about. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to let you pause here and come back in a minute or two after you've read these and tried to decide what they are. Okay. Article 6, Section 2, as you read through that, it says that the Constitution and laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land. This is what's referred to as the Supremacy Clause. So federal law takes precedence or is supreme to state law. The U.S. Constitution takes precedence over state law or state constitutions. Supremacy Clause is built into the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8 is the necessary and proper clause. Gives government, it gives the federal government, since it's the last clause of Article 1, Section 8, where all the enumerated powers are. This is where it says that the federal government has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution all of the enumerated powers above in Article 1, Section 8. And finally, Amendment 10 says this is where the reserved powers come from, powers not delegated to the U.S. by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So Article 1, the first one says the Constitution and the federal laws are supreme. The federal government has not just the enumerated powers, but anything that's necessary and proper for carrying them out. And then the 10th Amendment says, hey, if it's not given to the federal government, then the state has that power, so reserve powers. So my question is, you know, how do you determine who has power in a particular situation? Who has final authority? Is it the federal government or the state governments? And that's something that has changed over time. Really, you have to think about that, somewhere on here, right? You can go more to the weak side, you can go more to the strong side. If we were completely, if we're the more we go to the strong side, then the federal government has more say in situations. If we go more to the weak side, it's no, the state governments have more say. So we're somewhere along that continuum. And federal, because we have this federal system of government that was necessitated by the unique circumstances of our founding. What the framers did was create there was this idea of what's called dual federalism. It's also referred to as layer cake federalism, but this is how things worked at the founding. It's kind of a balance on that scale between federal and state authority. So there's the national government, there's the state government, and the idea is that let the national government operate in its sphere, let the state government operate in its sphere, and let there be very little interaction between the layers. So hence the name layer cake federalism. Um, and what you try to do is make sure that you reduce areas of conflict. You try to avoid conflict, but when conflict arises, that conflict is resolved by the Supreme Court because of the supremacy clause, and then that has typically, since our founding, um, the federal government has won more of those conflicts than state governments have. Um, so even though there was a balance, there's been this steady growth through Supreme Court cases of power to the national government. And a key one has to do with this concurrent power to charter banks and corporations. Because if you read Article 1, Section 8, there is nothing in there that says the federal government has that power. It's not, I mean, you can go back and look in Article 1, Section 8. It does not give, it doesn't enumerate a power to charter a bank, but it does say you can coin money and you can regulate interstate and foreign commerce and other things, but it doesn't say anything about chartering a bank. So this was the um, what was at issue in the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. It's a huge Supreme Court case um, that revolved around the establishment of the U.S. Bank. The U.S. Bank was part of, it was a creation of Alexander Hamilton, who was our first Treasury Secretary. It was part of the initial formation of government, and it created a lot of controversy. And the controversy revolved around the federal government doesn't have that power, only states have that power. It's not in the Constitution. How can the federal government do this? So that wound up before the Supreme Court, and John Marshall, who was a Federalist himself, ruled in this case that um, let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, even which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited but consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. So what he's saying is that even though the federal government doesn't have an enumerated power to charter a bank, it is necessary and proper given other enumerated powers it has. So Marshall opened the door for the growth of federal government power through the necessary and proper clause to include powers that aren't specifically enumerated. That's how that case was resolved. We had the U.S. Bank um, through 18 for a number of years, and then it was we had a second bank in the United States, and today we have what's called the Federal Reserve. So a central bank is something that the Supreme Court said is constitutional because of the necessary and proper clause. But there are other powers as well, like providing for public health, safety, welfare, and morals. These are what are called police powers. So, what about unemployment? Is that just a state problem, or education, or welfare, or bridges? Aren't those just state problems? Well, if you look at what's happened over the past few fiscal years, this is, funding for bridges. Federal government gives money to the states for bridges and infrastructure investment. That's something that the federal government does. It's engaging in this police power, even though that's a reserved power to the states. So the question is, how is this possible? And I'll address that in a next video.